The emergency room at Naval Medical Center San Diego had seen its share of chaos, but nothing quite prepared the night shift for what rolled through those doors at 3:47 hours on a Tuesday morning in March. The trauma bay erupted into controlled pandemonium as gurneys crashed through double doors, each bearing the broken body of an operator who'd been pulled from a firefight in the Hindu Kush barely 18 hours prior. Blood soaked through field dressings. Monitors screamed. And in the center of it all stood a nurse the staff had nicknamed the Rookie, a woman they'd spent 6 months condescending to, a woman whose scrubs never quite seemed to fit the same way theirs did, a woman who moved through the ER with a strange precision that felt both mechanical and impossibly calm. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Nadia Kasrevi, though the name tag clipped to her chest read only N. Kasrevi, RN. The doctors barked orders without looking at her. The senior nurses assigned her the grunt work. She'd been at this hospital for half a year, and in that time she'd become invisible in the way that competent people sometimes do when they choose not to announce themselves. She documented wounds with photographic accuracy. She anticipated medication needs before physicians requested them. She knew which IV gauge worked best for dehydrated operators, and which antibiotics the SEAL teams were typically pre-treated with before insertion. But none of that mattered to the staff, who saw only what they wanted to see. A middle-aged woman who'd somehow landed a nursing position without paying her dues, someone who probably knew an administrator or had some diversity checkbox that needed filling. What they didn't know, what she'd never told them because the question had never been asked properly, was that before she'd retrained as a trauma nurse, Nadia Kasrevi had spent 16 years as a Navy flight surgeon. Before that, she'd been a helicopter pilot. And before that, in another life that felt both distant and immediate, she'd flown combat search and rescue missions in places that didn't officially exist on any map the American public was allowed to see. The first gurney held a SEAL captain whose femoral artery had been compromised by shrapnel. He was pale, shocky, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. As the trauma team swarmed, Nadia stepped into position with the calm of someone who'd done this dance in actual field hospitals under actual fire. Her hands moved. The bleeding slowed. And then the captain's eyes opened, focused, and locked onto her face with an intensity that cut through the morphine haze. What happened next would unravel everything the hospital staff thought they knew. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, was explaining the surgical approach in the patronizing tone he reserved for nurses he considered beneath his station when the SEAL captain's hand shot up, trembling but deliberate, and locked onto Nadia's wrist. Not grabbing, holding. The way you hold onto something that matters. The trauma bay went quiet in that strange way emergency rooms sometimes do, a pocket of silence in the storm. The captain's voice came out as a rasp, damaged vocal cords fighting against intubation trauma and dehydration, but the words were crystal clear. "Valkyrie 6, he said, "Ma'am." Then his hand released her wrist, moved to his forehead, and despite the IV lines and the blood and the shattered femur, Captain Jonathan Reese rendered the sharpest salute his broken body could manage. Dr. Webb froze mid-sentence. The senior nurse dropped the catheter kit she'd been preparing, and Nadia Kasrevi, the woman they'd spent 6 months treating like a probationary employee who'd barely earned her place, stood perfectly still as the weight of recognition settled over the room like fallout. "At ease, Captain," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the deference they were used to hearing from her. "Save your strength." But Reese wasn't done. His eyes, gray and sharp despite the pain medication flooding his system, tracked to Dr. Webb. "This woman," he managed, each word costing him, "pulled my team out of Helmand Province in 2009, landed her bird in a hot LZ under fire, took an RPG through the tail rotor, still got us out." He paused, breathing hard. "Show some fucking respect." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense with implication, with the sudden weight of history none of them had known existed. Nadia's expression didn't change. She'd learned years ago that reaction was a luxury field medics couldn't afford. Her hands continued their work, adjusting the pressure dressing, monitoring the blood flow, moving with that same uncanny precision that suddenly looked less like luck and more like expertise earned in places most of these people had only seen on CNN. Dr. Webb's face went through several colors: red, white, a peculiar shade of gray that matched the institutional paint on the walls. We didn't, he started, then stopped, realizing that any explanation would only dig the hole deeper. You didn't ask, Nadia said simply, not looking up from her patient. People rarely do. Another gurney crashed through the doors. Another operator, this one with a sucking chest wound and a tension pneumothorax developing in real time. The team moved to respond, but there was a hesitation now, a recalibration happening beneath the surface. They were seeing her differently, wondering what else they'd missed, wondering what other assumptions they'd made about the quiet woman who never bragged, never corrected them, never demanded the respect her experience had earned. Nadia moved to the new patient with that same fluid economy of motion. Her assessment was faster than the attending's. Her hands placed the chest tube with a confidence that spoke of muscle memory built over hundreds of similar procedures. And as she worked, Captain Reese kept watching her with an expression that was part gratitude, part vindication, and part something else, a recognition of what it costs to be good at something when nobody expects you to be good at anything. The senior nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd spent 6 months assigning Nadia to bedpan duty and medication reconciliation, approached slowly. "Commander," she said, the title foreign in her mouth. "I didn't realize you were." "Navy," Nadia finished. "Flight surgeon, helicopter pilot. 16 years active duty before I retrained. But you're right, you didn't realize, because I'm just the rookie nurse who showed up without the right pedigree." Patricia had the grace to look ashamed. "Why didn't you tell us?" Nadia finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting Patricia's without anger, without accusation, just a flat statement of fact. "Would you have believed me if I had?" The answer hung in the air, unspoken but understood. No, they wouldn't have, because Nadia Kasrevi didn't fit their mental image of what a combat veteran looked like. She was 43. She was 5'5". She wore reading glasses and kept her graying hair in a practical bun. She didn't swagger. She didn't tell war stories. She just did her job with a competence that made her invisible until the moment someone who actually knew decided to make her visible. The night wore on, more casualties came through, and something shifted in the way the team moved around her. Requests became questions. Orders became consultations. The doctors started asking her opinion on treatment approaches. The nurses started actually watching what she did instead of assuming she didn't know. It wasn't respect yet, not fully, but it was the beginning of something. At 6:20, during a brief lull, Dr. Webb approached her at the medication station. He looked like a man trying to swallow something bitter. "Commander Kasrevi," he began, stumbling over the rank. "I owe you an apology. I've been unprofessional, dismissive. I assumed." "You assumed what everyone assumes," Nadia interrupted, her voice neither warm nor cold. "That experience looks a certain way. That competence announces itself. That anyone worth respecting makes sure you know they're worth respecting." She finished logging the morphine dosage, her handwriting precise. "But here's what you didn't assume, Dr. Webb. You didn't assume I might have reasons for keeping quiet. You didn't assume that maybe, just maybe, I was more interested in doing good work than in making sure everyone knew I'd done good work." Webb nodded slowly. "The captain said you took an RPG through the tail rotor, that you still got them out." "The captain was drugged and traumatized," Nadia replied. "His memory is probably enhanced by gratitude and morphine." "Is it true?" She met his eyes. "The official record says my aircraft experienced mechanical failure during a routine medical evacuation. The unofficial record is none of your business, doctor." But the way she said it, with just enough edge to confirm what the official record had been designed to hide, told him everything he needed to know. This woman had flown into hell. She'd brought people back. And she'd done it quietly, without needing the world to know, because the work itself had been the point. Captain Reese was stabilized by 700. The surgical team prepped him for the OR, where they'd spend the next 6 hours reconstructing his femur and repairing the vascular damage. As they wheeled him out, he caught Nadia's eye one more time. "Valkyrie 6, he said again, clearer now. "Thank you, then and now." She nodded once. "Do your PT, Captain. Don't make me regret keeping you alive." It was said deadpan, but there was warmth underneath, the kind of dark humor that people who have seen the worst develop as armor against it. Reese managed a weak smile, and then he was gone, disappearing through the surgical suite doors. The shift ended at 7:30. Nadia documented her cases with the same meticulous detail she always did, signed off on her patients, and headed for the locker room. Patricia caught up with her in the hallway, moving quickly despite the exhaustion that comes from 8 hours of trauma response. "Commander," she said, slightly breathless, "can I ask you something?" Nadia paused, hand on the locker room door. "You can ask." "Why nursing? If you were a flight surgeon, a pilot, why retrain? Why start over in a field where people would, where we treated you like a rookie?" Nadia finished. She considered the question, really considered it in a way that suggested she'd asked it of herself many times. "Because flying ended for me 9 years ago. Medical reasons. Inner ear damage from a crash that shouldn't have been survivable. The Navy gave me options, desk jobs, administrative positions, ways to finish my 20 and retire with full benefits." She opened the locker room door but didn't go through. "But I didn't join to sit at a desk. I joined to help people in the worst moments of their lives. Flying was how I did that. When flying stopped being an option, nursing became the next best thing. Even knowing you'd have to start at the bottom, even knowing people would judge me, underestimate me, treat me like I didn't know what I was doing." Nadia's smile was thin. "Patricia, I flew helicopters in a military that spent decades telling women they couldn't do exactly what I was doing. Being underestimated isn't new, it's just annoying." She let the door close behind her, leaving Patricia standing in the hallway with the weight of her own assumptions sitting heavy in her chest. Inside the locker room, Nadia changed out of her scrubs and into civilian clothes. Jeans, a faded navy sweatshirt, running shoes that had seen better days. She looked like anyone's aunt, anyone's mom, anyone except the person who'd flown into hostile territory to pull broken operators out of the fire. And that was exactly the point. She'd learned long ago that looking unremarkable was its own kind of tactical advantage. People told you things when they didn't think you mattered. They revealed themselves when they thought you weren't paying attention. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. She almost deleted it, then noticed the area code. Virginia, Quantico region. She opened it. "Commander Kasravi, this is Master Sergeant Chen, MARSOC. Captain Reese gave me your number. We have a situation developing. Need a consult from someone with your specific background. Call when you can. Not urgent but time-sensitive." Nadia stared at the message for a long moment. Specific background. That could mean flight medicine, could mean helicopter operations, could mean something else entirely, something that touched on the parts of her service record that were still classified, still buried under layers of need-to-know restriction. She saved the number, didn't reply, and headed home. Whatever MARSOC wanted, it could wait until she'd slept. The dead couldn't be helped by exhaustion, and the living deserved better than a doctor running on fumes and adrenaline crash. Her apartment was small, neat, almost aggressively normal. No military memorabilia on the walls. No photographs of helicopters or dress uniform ceremonies. Just books, plants, a cat named Distovsky who regarded her with the disdain only cats can truly master. She fed him, showered, and collapsed into bed as the San Diego sun climbed higher into a cloudless sky. Sleep came fast but brought dreams she'd rather not have. The familiar ones. The sound of rotor wash and small arms fire. The smell of blood and aviation fuel. The weight of bodies she'd loaded into her bird, some alive, some not, all of them depending on her to fly through conditions that would ground any sane pilot. She'd stopped trying to explain these dreams to the VA therapist. The woman meant well, but she'd never been in combat, never had to make the calculations that came with triage under fire. Some experiences didn't translate across that divide. Nadia woke at 1400, groggy but functional. She made coffee, fed Dostoevsky again, because he was a liar who claimed he'd never been fed, and finally returned Master Sergeant Chen's call. He answered on the second ring. "Commander Kasravi, thank you for calling back." "Master Sergeant, what can I do for MARSOC?" There was a pause, the kind that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "We have a training incident. 3 operators medevaced out of 29 Palms yesterday. They're at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth now. Stable but complicated. The thing is, ma'am, the circumstances of their injuries are inconsistent." Nadia's coffee paused halfway to her lips. Inconsistent how? Their story doesn't match their wounds, and their wounds don't match the training exercise they were running. Another pause. "Captain Reese said you were the best at reading what people don't say, that you could look at an injury pattern and tell him what actually happened versus what someone claimed happened." "That's a significant claim, Master Sergeant." "Yes, ma'am. He also said you'd never take credit for it, which is how he knew it was true." Despite herself, Nadia smiled. "What do you need from me?" "Medical consult. Unofficial. Come to Portsmouth, look at these operators, tell me if I'm crazy for thinking something isn't adding up. All expenses paid. You'd be doing the Corps a favor." "I'm Navy, Master Sergeant. We don't do the Corps favors, we charge interest." Chen laughed, a sound of genuine relief. "Fair enough, ma'am. What's your rate?" "Honesty," Nadia said flatly. "You tell me what you really think happened, not what the official report says. Then I'll tell you if the bodies support your theory." "Deal. Can you fly out tomorrow?" Nadia looked around her apartment. At the cat. At the books. At the life she'd built that was safe and predictable and utterly free of the chaos that had defined her first 16 years of service. She should say no. Should tell Chen to send her the medical files and she'd review them remotely. Should maintain the boundary between the person she'd been and the person she was trying to become. "I'll be there by 1800, she said instead. "Send me the details." She hung up before he could thank her, before she could change her mind, before the part of her brain that handled risk assessment could overrule the part that still missed the work. Because that was the truth Nadia rarely admitted, even to herself. She missed it. Missed the stakes. Missed the feeling of being the only person in the room who could solve a specific problem. Missed being Valkyrie 6 instead of just Nurse Kasravi, the rookie who didn't know her place. The flight to Virginia was uneventful. She read during the journey a biography of a surgeon who'd pioneered trauma protocols during Vietnam. It was good work, well researched, but it missed something essential about combat medicine. It missed the sound. The way blood smelled different depending on which artery was compromised. The specific quality of silence that meant someone had just died despite your best efforts. You couldn't write those things into a book. You had to live them. Master Sergeant Chen met her at Norfolk International. He was exactly what she expected: compact, alert, carrying himself with the coiled energy of someone who'd spent a career in situations where relaxation could be fatal. He wasn't what most people pictured when they thought Marine, which made him very good at being a Marine. "Commander Kasravi," he said, offering his hand. "Appreciate you coming out." "Show me the patience," Nadia replied, skipping the pleasantries. "We can talk after." The drive to Portsmouth took 40 minutes. Chen didn't waste them. 3 operators, all experienced, running a standard desert navigation exercise. According to their report, they encountered unexpected enemy contact, which shouldn't have been possible in a training area on U.S. soil, and sustained injuries during the engagement and subsequent evasion. "What kind of injuries?" "Gunshot wounds, 2 rifle caliber, 1 handgun, plus assorted trauma consistent with a hard landing or fall from height. The thing is, ma'am, the training area they were in doesn't have any elevation. It's flat scrubland. No cliffs, no structures tall enough to produce those injuries. Nadia absorbed this. You think they're lying. I think something happened that isn't in the report. Whether they're lying or protecting someone or protecting themselves, I don't know. That's where you come in. The hospital was smaller than San Diego, quieter, with the specific atmosphere of a facility that handled serious cases but not mass casualties. Chen had clearance that moved them through security without delay. Within minutes, Nadia was standing outside a private room, reviewing charts on a tablet Chen had provided. Patient 1, Staff Sergeant David Torres, 28. 2 gunshot wounds, one through the left shoulder, one grazing the right ribcage, both through and through. Rifle caliber 5.56 based on the wound channel measurements. He'd lost blood but nothing critical had been hit. Lucky or precise, depending on who was shooting. Patient 2, Sergeant Marcus Webb. No relation to Dr. Webb, just one of those coincidences that felt meaningful when you were tired. Handgun round through the right thigh, missing the femoral by centimeters. Looked almost surgical in its placement, like someone who knew anatomy had chosen exactly where to shoot to cause pain without permanent damage. Patient 3, Corporal Lisa Hammond. The anomaly: multiple lacerations, 2 broken ribs, and a gunshot wound through her left hand. The hand injury was defensive, the kind you got when you put your hand up to stop something or someone. The broken ribs and lacerations suggested a fall or beating, but the pattern was wrong for either. I need to talk to them, Nadia said. They're expecting you, or rather they're expecting a medical consultant. I didn't tell them who you were. Good, let's keep it that way. She entered Tor's room first. He was awake, watching television with the sound muted. Military news, footage of a situation developing in the South China Sea. When he saw her, he hit the remote and the screen went dark. Staff Sergeant Torres, Nadia said, her voice professionally neutral. I'm Commander Kasrevi. I've been asked to consult on your case. Tor's eyes traveled over her, making assessments. She could see him cataloging. Civilian clothes, no uniform, older than most Navy doctors, something in her bearing that didn't quite fit. Ma'am, he said carefully, I thought the doctors here had everything under control. They do. This is just a second opinion, routine when injuries occur during training exercises. She moved to his bedside, pulled up his chart on the room's computer. Tell me what happened. He recited the official version: unexpected contact, return fire, tactical retreat, sustained injuries during movement to extract point. His delivery was smooth, practiced, but there were tells. The way his eyes moved left when he mentioned the unexpected contact. The slight hesitation before sustained injuries. Nadia listened without interrupting. Then she examined his wounds, not the dressings but the entry and exit points, the angles, the tissue disruption. These were fired from elevation, she said flatly. Someone above you, shooting down at approximately 30 to 40 degrees based on the wound channel trajectory. Torres went very still. The terrain was flat, Nadia finished. Master Sergeant Chen briefed me. So either you're lying about where you were, or you're lying about what happened, or someone was on a structure that shouldn't have existed in that training area. Which is it? He stared at her. Ma'am, with respect, I don't know what you're. Staff Sergeant, I've spent more years reading gunshot wounds than you've been alive. These injuries tell a story. The question is whether you're going to tell me the same story or keep reciting whatever cover narrative you've been instructed to maintain. The silence stretched. Finally, Torres said, I need to know who you are, really are, before I say anything else. Fair enough. Nadia pulled out her phone, called up an old photograph. Her in-flight suit, standing in front of an HH-60 Pave Hawk, helmet under one arm. The photo was from 2009, Afghanistan. She was younger, harder, wearing an expression that had nothing to do with posing for a camera and everything to do with having just flown her 6th mission in 36 hours. Torres looked at the photo, looked at her. Valkyrie 6, he said softly. That was a long time ago. Captain Reese served with you. He talks about you sometimes, about the Helmand extraction. Tors seemed to make a decision. Ma'am, what we tell you stays between us. Depends on what you tell me. If it's criminal, no. If it's embarrassing, yes. If it's somewhere in between, we'll negotiate. He nodded slowly. It wasn't enemy contact, it was friendly fire, sort of. Explain, sort of. We were running the exercise. Standard stuff, navigation under stress conditions. But there was another unit in the area. Tier 1 assets doing their own thing. We weren't supposed to encounter them. Weren't supposed to even know they were there. But our routes overlapped and suddenly we're face to face with operators who think we're opposing force. Nadia absorbed this. They shot you. They shot toward us, warning shots that got too close. Then when we returned fire training rounds, ma'am, we weren't carrying live ammunition. They escalated, thought we were actual hostiles. He touched his shoulder, wincing. By the time everyone figured out the clusterfuck, 3 of us were bleeding and the Tier 1 guys were gone like ghosts. And the cover story came from above, way above, because officially that Tier 1 unit wasn't in that location, running that operation, training for whatever they're training for. So officially, we encountered unexpected enemy contact that must have been cartel elements who wandered across the border or some other bullshit explanation that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Nadia sat down in the visitor's chair. You understand that lying in an official report is a court-martial offense. Yes, ma'am. We also understand that telling the truth would compromise an operation we don't have clearance to know about, involving people whose identities we definitely don't have clearance to know. So we're stuck between criminal charges for lying and criminal charges for revealing classified information we're not supposed to know. It was elegant in a terrible way, a perfect bureaucratic trap. Who told you to lie? No one, ma'am. That's the beauty of it. We were just told very strongly that the truth would be problematic, and that perhaps we'd misremembered the details, and that memory under stress is an unreliable thing. The official report we filed was our own choice, completely voluntary. Coerced voluntary. Is there any other kind in the military, ma'am? Despite everything, Nadia smiled. No, Staff Sergeant, there is not. She visited the other 2 patients. Webb confirmed Tor's story with minor variations. Hammond added one crucial detail: she'd recognized one of the Tier 1 operators. Not his face, which had been covered, but his movement pattern, the way he handled his weapon. She'd trained with him years ago at Coronado. Wouldn't say his name, but the implication was clear. SEALs, or something SEAL adjacent, doing something they very much did not want documented. By the time Nadia finished her consultations, it was nearly midnight. Chen was waiting in the hospital cafeteria, drinking coffee that smelled like it had been made during the Clinton administration. Well, he asked. Nadia sat across from him. Your operators are telling the truth, modified truth, but truth. They encountered friendly fire from a unit that officially wasn't there. The injuries are consistent with warning shots that weren't quite warning enough, followed by a brief exchange where one side had real ammunition and the other side had training rounds. Can you prove it? Can I prove the wound trajectories match shots from elevation in terrain that has no elevation? Yes. Can I prove who fired those shots? No. And neither can you, Master Sergeant, because whoever those Tier 1 assets were, they're protected by classification levels that make both of us irrelevant. Chen nodded slowly. He'd expected this answer. What do I do? You document the truth in your report. Injuries consistent with live fire engagement, circumstances unclear, recommend investigation. Then you watch that recommendation disappear into whatever bureaucratic black hole handles embarrassing incidents involving special operations forces. She finished his coffee. It was as bad as it smelled. Your operators will be fine. Their careers will probably be fine. But the truth will stay buried because the truth is inconvenient. That doesn't bother you. Master Sergeant, I flew missions that officially never happened to places that officially don't exist, to extract people who officially weren't there. Being bothered by buried truth is a luxury I gave up around 2007. They sat in silence for a moment, two veterans contemplating the gap between what happened and what gets recorded. Finally, Chen said, "Captain Reese said you were worth 5 consultants. He wasn't wrong." Captain Reese was high on morphine and gratitude. His judgment was impaired. He also said you'd say something exactly like that. Nadia stood. "I'll write up my findings, send them to you by tomorrow. You'll owe me dinner next time you're in San Diego." "Deal, ma'am." She flew back the next morning, arrived home to find Dostovsky had knocked over a plant in protest of her absence, and returned to her normal nursing shifts at Naval Medical Center San Diego. The staff treated her differently now. Not quite with respect. That would take time, but with a wariness that acknowledged they'd misjudged her. Dr. Webb asked her opinion during rounds. Patricia invited her to lunch. The small gestures of institutional recalibration. But something had shifted in Nadia too. The trip to Portsmouth had reminded her of what she was good at, what she'd spent 16 years becoming expert in: reading violence, understanding the language of injury, translating the body's testimony into truth. 2 weeks later, another text, this time from a number she recognized. Captain Reese, recovered enough to type. "Ma'am, heard you helped Chen's people. Thank you. Question, you still flying?" She stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Medical disqualification. Inner ear damage. Why?" "Because there's a program, not military, contract work. They need pilots with specific experience. Combat search and rescue background, medical training, ability to work in denied areas without support. The pay is exceptional. The danger is significant. Thought of you immediately." Nadia's first instinct was refusal. She'd left that life, built something new, found peace in the routine of nursing, in the predictability of hospitals where the bullets came from disease instead of rifles. But her second instinct, the one she'd learned to trust in cockpits when decisions had to be made faster than thought aloud, said something different. "Send details," she typed. "No promises." The details arrived an hour later. A PDF marked confidential, requiring 3 passwords to open. Inside was a job description that read like something from a thriller novel. Contract pilot for a private military corporation that handled extractions in places governments couldn't officially operate. Medical background required. Combat experience preferred. Prior classification clearance essential. The salary made her pause. 6 figures per mission, with bonuses for hostile environment operations. The requirements made her laugh. Candidates must be comfortable operating in isolation, under fire, with minimal support, must make life-or-death medical decisions without consultation, must be willing to die for principles of extraction, no one left behind. It was everything she'd left behind, everything she'd thought she was done with. Everything that still kept her awake at night with dreams of rotor wash and blood. She closed the PDF, deleted the message, went to work her shift. But 3 days later, she opened the PDF again, read it more carefully, started asking herself the questions she'd been avoiding. What was she doing in San Diego? Saving lives, yes. Important work, yes. But how many of those lives were in actual danger? How many truly needed someone with her specific skills? How many situations arose where being Valkyrie 6 instead of Nurse Kasrevi actually mattered? The answer was uncomfortable. Almost none. She was overqualified for the work she was doing. Not in credentials, plenty of nurses were as skilled technically, but in experience. In the specific kind of decision-making that came from having to choose who lived and who died while people were shooting at your helicopter. She called the number attached to the PDF. A woman answered, professional, crisp. "Artemis Solutions. How may I direct your call?" "My name is Nadia Kasrevi. I received information about a pilot position. I'd like to speak with someone about it." One moment, please. Hold music. Classical, Brahms. Strange choice for a military contractor. Then a man's voice gravelly with an accent she couldn't quite place. Eastern European maybe. Russian diaspora. Commander Kasrevy, we've been hopping you'd call. My name is Alexei Volkov. I run Artemis's extraction division. Captain Reese speaks very highly of you. Captain Reese has a tendency toward exaggeration when medicated. Volkov laughed, a sound like stones grinding. Perhaps, but his medical records from that Helmand extraction are not exaggerations, nor is your flight record, nor is the classified addendum to your service jacket that mentions operations in Syria, Yemen, and Somalia that never officially occurred. Nadia's hand tightened on the phone. That's sealed information. Sealed to people without the right clearances, yes. We have the right clearances, Commander. We know exactly who you are. The question is whether you know who you want to be. It was a good line, probably practiced, definitely effective. What do you want from me, Mr. Volkov? I want you to come to our training facility in North Carolina. Spend 3 days. See what we do. Meet the people you'd be working with. Then decide if this life still fits you or if you're content changing bedpans for people who don't understand what you've sacrificed. The bedpan comment was a cheap shot, but it landed anyway. And if I decide it doesn't fit? Then you go home. No obligation. We pay for your time and travel. You lose nothing except 3 days. When? Next week, Monday through Wednesday, we'll handle everything. Nadia should have said no. Should have recognized the recruitment technique, the way they were hooking her pride, her competence, her need to matter. Should have stayed in San Diego with Dostoevsky and her books and her safe, predictable life. I'll be there, she said instead. The facility was outside Jacksonville, hidden in pine forest that looked endless from the air. The shuttle from the airport was unmarked. The driver was former military, she could tell from the way he moved, the way his eyes tracked the mirrors, the way he didn't make small talk. They drove for 40 minutes, the last 20 on unpaved roads that wound through trees too thick to see through. The compound itself looked like a corporate retreat center, tasteful buildings, manicured grounds, nothing that screamed private military contractor. But Nadia noticed the sight lines, the clear kill zones around each building, the discreet security cameras covering every approach. This place could become a fortress in minutes if necessary. Volkov met her at the main building. He was shorter than his voice suggested, maybe 5'8", with the compact build of someone who'd stayed in fighting shape well into his 50s. Gray hair, gray eyes, a scar along his jaw that spoke of close-quarters combat. "Commander," he said, shaking her hand. "Welcome to Artemis. How was your flight?" "Commercial and boring, the way I prefer flights these days." He smiled. "We'll see about that. Come, let me show you what we do." The tour was impressive and slightly terrifying. They had aircraft, not military surplus but actual contract variants of Blackhawks and Little Birds, maintained to specifications that exceeded Army standards. They had medical facilities that rivaled what she'd seen at Level 1 trauma centers. They had armories, training ranges, and a full mission operations center that looked like something from CIA headquarters. "We handle extractions no one else will touch," Volkov explained as they walked. "Journalists in hostile territories, aid workers kidnapped by terror groups, business executives grabbed for ransom. Sometimes," he paused meaningfully, "people the government wants extracted but can't acknowledge. Black operations. Gray operations. There's a difference. We don't do regime change. Don't do assassinations. Don't do anything that violates international law too flagrantly. But extraction, that's what we do best. And for extractions in the worst places, under the worst conditions, we need pilots who understand that the mission doesn't end when you reach the LZ. Sometimes the mission is keeping people alive long enough to reach a hospital that's 600 miles away over hostile territory." He led her to a hangar where a Blackhawk sat, doors off, configured for medical evacuation. Nadia's hands moved without conscious thought, checking the interior setup, the equipment mounts, the medical supply configuration. It was good, better than good. Someone who understood combat medicine had designed this loadout. "Want to take her up?" Volkov asked. Nadia turned. "I'm not cleared to fly. Medical disqualification." FAA medical disqualification. We're not FAA. We're contract, which means we set our own standards. If you can fly the bird, you're cleared. It was reckless, possibly illegal, definitely against every regulation in the book. Nadia should have refused on principle. Instead, she climbed into the pilot's seat. The helicopter felt right. That was the only way to describe it, like putting on old shoes that had molded to your feet. The controls responded to her touch with a familiarity that made 9 years disappear. She ran through pre-flight checks from memory, her hands finding switches and controls without conscious thought. "Radio check," she said into the headset. "Lima Charlie, Commander," Volkov's voice came back. "Tower clears you for local orientation flight. Try not to hit the trees." Nadia lifted off smoothly, the helicopter rising into autumn air that smelled like pine and possibility. She flew the pattern, nothing fancy, just getting reacquainted with the physics of rotary flight. But even basic flying felt like coming home, like remembering who she'd been before inner ear damage and mandatory retirement, and the decision to rebuild herself as something safer. After 20 minutes, she sat down with a precision that surprised even her. Volkov was waiting as she shut down the engines. "Still got it," he said. "Apparently." Nadia climbed out, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and emotion. "That was stupid. If I'd crashed." "You didn't crash, and you won't crash. Your inner ear damage affects sustained flight operations, not basic piloting skills. We checked your medical records thoroughly. You can fly missions. You just can't fly A-tower combat sorties anymore. What we need is 2, maybe 3 hours maximum, well within your capabilities." He'd done his homework, known exactly what to offer, how to present it. Nadia felt the manipulation but couldn't quite bring herself to be angry about it, because he was right. She could still fly, still had the skills, still had the instincts that made the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. The rest of the visit was a carefully orchestrated seduction. They showed her the mission archive successful extractions from Yemen, Syria, Mali, places where governments feared to operate. They introduced her to other contract pilots, all former military, all carrying the same competence she recognized in herself. They walked her through mission planning protocols that were more thorough than anything she'd seen in the Navy. And on the final day, they showed her the memorial wall. 23 names, contract pilots and medical personnel who died in the line of duty, extracting others, holding the line between rescue and abandonment. Each name had a brief citation describing how they died. Most involved hostile fire. Some involved mechanical failure. One involved a pilot named Sarah Chen who'd refused to leave an LZ until all casualties were loaded, even as enemy forces overran her position. Nadia stood in front of that wall for a long time, reading names, understanding the price. "We don't hide the risk," Volkov said quietly. "This work kills people, good people, people who are better pilots and better humans than most of the ones they're saving. But someone has to do it. Someone has to be willing to fly into places where death is probable, because leaving people behind is unacceptable." "Why me?" Nadia asked. "You could hire younger pilots, people without medical restrictions." We do, but young pilots make young pilot mistakes. They have courage without wisdom, skill without judgment. You've done this work for 16 years. You know when to push and when to pull back. You know the difference between bravery and suicide. And most importantly, he gestured to the memorial wall, you understand what it costs to do this work well. That night back in her hotel room, Nadia called Patricia. "I need to tell you something," she said when the other woman answered. "I'm leaving the hospital, taking another position." There was a long pause. Did something happen? Because we're trying, Nadia, trying to make things right after how we treated you. It's not about you. It's about me, about what I'm good at. Nursing is important work, critical work, but it's not my work, not anymore. What will you do? Fly helicopters again, for a private contractor, medical extractions in conflict zones. Another pause, longer this time. That sounds dangerous. It is, but it's also what I trained for, what I'm built for. Being safe isn't the same as being useful. Nadia, you're one of the best nurses I've ever worked with. Even in 6 months I could see that. You save lives here. I save lives here that would likely be saved by someone else if I weren't here. The people I'll be flying for don't have someone else. They have me or they have no one. That's the difference. Patricia understood. You could hear it in her silence. When do you leave? 2 weeks. I'll work my notice. Train my replacement if you can find one. The final 2 weeks passed quickly. Nadia worked her shifts with the same competence she always had, but now the staff saw it differently, saw her differently. Dr. Webb threw her a going-away party in the break room. Patricia gave her a plaque that said, "To the best rookie we ever underestimated." Captain Reese, recovered enough to walk with a cane, showed up unannounced and saluted her formally in front of everyone. "Valkyrie 6, he said loud enough for the whole ER to hear. "It was an honor being saved by you then. It's an honor being saved by you now." On her last day, she cleaned out her locker, turned in her badge, and walked out of Naval Medical Center San Diego for the final time. In the parking lot, she sat in her car and let herself feel the weight of what she was doing, the safety she was giving up, the life she could have had, the normal, predictable existence that most people would consider the smart choice. Then she started the engine and drove home to pack. Artemis Solutions sent movers for her furniture. Most of it went into storage. She kept only what fit in 2 duffel bags: clothes, books, a photograph of her old flight crew from Afghanistan. Dostovsky went to Patricia, who'd agreed to adopt him with the understanding that cats were indifferent to ownership changes and would likely judge her harshly. The flight to North Carolina felt different this time. Not a visit, a commitment. She'd signed a 2-year contract with Artemis with options to extend. The money was absurd. The danger was real. The work was exactly what she'd been missing without knowing she'd been missing it. Training started immediately. Even experienced pilots needed certification in Artemis protocols. Night flying with night vision goggles, hot LZ procedures, hostile fire evasion, combat first aid refreshers, weapons qualifications, because sometimes extraction pilots had to provide their own security. Nadia excelled, not because she was naturally gifted, but because she'd done all of this before, years ago, when the stakes were live and the training was learning to not die. The younger pilots struggled with some scenarios. She didn't. And slowly, the same pattern emerged that had emerged in San Diego. Initial skepticism giving way to grudging respect, giving way to something approaching awe. Her first mission came 6 weeks into training, journalist extraction from northern Syria. The journalist had embedded with Kurdish forces, gotten separated during a Turkish bombing campaign, and was hiding in a village that would be overrun within 24 hours. The U.S. government couldn't acknowledge his presence. NATO couldn't help without diplomatic complications. But his newspaper could hire Artemis, and Artemis could send a helicopter that officially didn't exist to pull him out. Nadia flew the mission with a co-pilot named Marcus, former Army, 2 tour in Iraq, steady hands and good instincts. They inserted at night, using terrain masking to avoid radar. The village was small, desperate, already showing signs of imminent collapse. The journalist was exactly where he'd said he'd be, hiding in a basement with 3 Kurdish fighters who'd refused to abandon him. The extraction took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of exposure, of vulnerability, of depending on speed and darkness to avoid being engaged. They loaded 5 people, the journalist, the 3 fighters, and a child the fighters refused to leave behind. Then Nadia pushed the helicopter to maximum speed, flying nap of the earth through mountain passes that would have terrified her 9 years ago but now just required focus. They made it across the border into Turkey, then climbed to altitude for the flight to Incirlik Air Base. The journalist was crying. The fighters were silent, processing survival. The child was asleep, exhausted beyond fear. In her headset, Marcus's voice, "Clean run, Commander, textbook." But Nadia knew better. There was no such thing as textbook when you were stealing people from war zones. There was only luck, skill, and the gap between what could have happened and what did. They flew 17 more missions over the next 9 months. Not all clean, not all successful. One mission in Yemen ended with hostile fire that damaged their tail rotor and forced an emergency landing in Saudi Arabia. Another in Mali required fighting their way out of an ambush with small arms fire while carrying wounded aid workers. The memorial wall at Artemis added 2 more names during Nadia's first year. Pilots she'd trained with. People who'd made the same choice she had about what mattered more than safety. But the work saved lives, real lives, people who would have died without intervention. And gradually Nadia felt something shift inside her. The guilt about leaving nursing faded. The doubt about whether she was making the right choice quieted. This was her work. This was what 16 years of training had prepared her for. Not changing bandages in San Diego. Not filing incident reports and attending staff meetings. This, flying into darkness to bring people home. A year into her contract, Volkov called her into his office. "We have an unusual request," he said without preamble. "Government contract. Well, quasi-government. State Department needs an extraction from Venezuela but can't use military assets without causing an international incident." Who's the target? Embassy staff. 3 people. Been held by Venezuelan intelligence for 2 weeks on spurious espionage charges. Negotiations have failed. State wants them out before the situation becomes a full hostage crisis. Nadia absorbed this. That's not extraction, that's a raid. It's extraction with complications, Volkov agreed. The facility they're being held in is urban, heavily guarded and located in central Caracas. We'd need to insert a ground team, penetrate the facility, extract the targets, and get them to an LZ where you'd be waiting. Then fly them out of Venezuelan airspace before their air force can respond. You're describing an act of war. I'm describing plausible deniability. If it goes wrong, state denies knowledge. We deny government contact. The contractors on the ground team get disavowed, and you get shot down trying to leave Venezuelan airspace. Wonderful, and if it goes right, you save 3 American lives and collect a bonus that's triple your usual rate. Nadia should have said no. Should have recognized this was crossing a line from gray operations into something darker. Should have walked away while she still could. But 3 Americans were being held. 3 people who'd signed up for diplomatic service, not imprisonment and torture. 3 lives that balanced against her safety, her principles, and her growing understanding that sometimes the right choice was also the most dangerous one. "I'm in," she said, "but I pick my co-pilot, and I want full autonomy over the flight plan. Your ground team does their job, I'll do mine, but I don't take orders once I'm airborne." Volkov smiled. "Deal. Mission is in 48 hours, start your planning." The next 2 days were intensive preparation. Nadia studied Venezuelan air defenses, mapped escape routes, identified every airport, military base, and potential complication between Caracas and international waters. She picked Marcus as co-pilot. He'd kept his head during the Yemen emergency, and she trusted him to stay calm when everything went sideways. The ground team was professional, experienced, and utterly terrifying. Former Delta operators, DEVGRU guys, people who'd spent careers doing things governments couldn't acknowledge. Their team leader was a man named Jackson who looked like he'd been carved from granite and bad decisions. "Simple plan," he told Nadia during the final brief. "We breach at 200 local, Extract targets by 2:15. Be at your LZ by 2:30. You pick us up, we fly home, everyone gets paid. And when it's not simple. Jackson smiled, no warmth in it. Then we improvise, try to keep up. They launched from a forward staging area in Colombia. 2 helicopters, Nadia's bird configured for extraction, a second bird carrying the ground team. They crossed into Venezuelan airspace at low altitude, using the cover of a thunderstorm to mask their radar signature. The insertion was smooth. The ground team fast-stroked down into a courtyard, disappeared into the darkness, and Nadia pulled away to wait at the predetermined LZ 15 kilometers from the target. Waiting was always the worst part. She circled at minimal altitude, engines just above idle, listening to radio chatter that was mostly silence punctuated by occasional tactical calls. Marcus watched the instruments. She watched the night sky, looking for signs of Venezuelan military response. At 2:18, Jackson's voice crackled over the radio. Valkyrie, we have targets, en route to LZ. Be advised we are compromised. Heavy pursuit, this will be a hot extract. Marcus swore quietly. Nadia just nodded, already spinning up the engines, already calculating approach vectors and escape routes. Copy that, Jackson. LZ is clear, come fast. They came fast. 3 SUVs screaming through Caracas streets, Venezuelan military vehicles in pursuit, small arms fire echoing off buildings. Nadia brought the helicopter down into a plaza, rotors creating a storm of dust and debris. The SUVs screeched to a halt. Doors flew open. Jackson's team moved with practiced efficiency. 3 embassy staff, hands zip-tied because there'd been no time to verify identities, were thrown bodily into the helicopter. Then the operators piled in, 2 of them maintaining suppressive fire as Venezuelan military vehicles closed in. Go, 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 Jackson shouted, and Nadia didn't need to be told twice. She lifted off as bullets sparked off the helicopter's armored undercarriage. Someone was screaming, one of the embassy staff, terror overriding training. Marcus called out airspeed and altitude while Nadia pushed the helicopter to maximum speed, heading for the coast and the international waters that represented safety. Behind them, Venezuelan Air Force scrambled fighters. Nadia could see them on radar, 2 contacts lifting off from Maracay Air Base. Fast movers, interceptors, birds that could catch her helicopter easily if she stayed on her current course. So she didn't stay on her current course. Instead, she dropped to wave-top altitude, flying so low the radar altimeter was screaming warnings, and turned south instead of north, away from safety, toward the Orinoco Delta, toward the maze of waterways and islands that would confuse radar and give her a chance. Valkyrie, that's the wrong direction, Jackson protested. That's the direction that keeps us alive, Nadia shot back. Those fighters can track us over open water. They can't track us through jungle. It was insane flying. Navigation by dead reckoning and instinct, threading through channels barely wider than the helicopter's rotor disc, using terrain and vegetation to break radar lock. The Venezuelan fighters orbited overhead searching, but they couldn't commit to the low altitude needed to find her. Too dangerous, too risky. After 40 minutes of this, Nadia finally turned north again, crossing into international waters before climbing to safer altitude. The Venezuelan fighters broke off, unwilling to risk an international incident by pursuing into Caribbean airspace. In the cargo bay, Jackson was laughing. Actual laughter, the kind that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. That was the craziest flying I've ever seen, and I've flown with the Night Stalkers. Nadia didn't respond. She was too busy shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with her now that immediate danger had passed. Marcus reached over, squeezed her shoulder briefly. You did good, Commander, real good. They landed at the forward staging area 90 minutes later. The embassy staff were transferred to State Department personnel who'd been waiting anxiously. Jackson's team dispersed like smoke. and Nadia finally allowed herself to sit down, to process what had just happened, to understand that she just participated in an operation that would never be acknowledged, never be documented, never be anything but a story that people would assume was exaggerated. Volkov was waiting when she finally made it back to North Carolina. "The client is pleased," he said simply. "Very pleased. They want to know if you'd be interested in similar work." Nadia looked at him for a long moment. Similar work meaning quasi-legal operations that could start international incidents. Similar work meaning extractions where the stakes are highest and the margin for error is smallest. "No," Nadia said flatly. "That was a one-time thing. I extract aid workers and journalists. I don't do regime change-adjacent operations." Volkov nodded. "No argument, no pressure. Fair enough. The offer stands if you change your mind." She didn't change her mind, but the Venezuela operation changed something in her. Before, she'd been good at this work. After, she was something more. The other pilots started calling her by her old call sign Valkyrie 6. New contractors heard the stories. The Syria extraction, the Yemen emergency, the Venezuela operation that officially never happened but that everyone somehow knew about. Her reputation grew. Artemis started specifically requesting her for their most difficult missions. Volkov offered her a team lead position. Other companies tried to recruit her with even more absurd salaries. But Nadia stayed with Artemis, stayed focused on the work that mattered, pulling people out of places where death was certain and hope was a helicopter appearing in darkness. 2 years became 4, 4 became 6. The memorial wall added more names. Nadia added more scars, more close calls, more nights where she woke up from dreams of crashes that hadn't quite happened. But she also added more saves, more lives, more people who walked away from certain death because someone had been willing to fly into hell to retrieve them. On the 6-year anniversary of leaving San Diego, she received an unexpected message. "Captain Reese, now Major Reese, stationed at SOCOM headquarters. Ma'am, need your advice on something. We're planning an operation. Complex extraction in denied territory. The brass wants to use our organic aviation assets. I think we need Artemis. Specifically, we need you." Nadia called him back immediately. "Major, what kind of operation?" "The kind we can't discuss on unclassified lines. Can you come to Tampa? All expenses paid, just a consultation, no commitment." She flew to Tampa 2 days later. MacDill Air Force Base looked exactly like every other military installation she'd spent time on. Lots of concrete, lots of security, lots of people moving with purpose. Reese met her at the gate, looking older but no less sharp. "Commander Kasravi," he said, shaking her hand. "Thank you for coming. You know I'm not commander anymore, right? I'm a civilian contractor." "Once a commander, always a commander, ma'am. Some ranks stick." He led her to a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, where she was briefed on an operation that made Venezuela look simple. American operatives embedded with resistance forces in an unnamed country. Intel suggested they'd been compromised, that enemy forces were closing in. The window for extraction was narrow. The terrain was hostile, and the nearest friendly forces were 600 miles away. "Why not use your own birds?" Nadia asked. "Because our birds are assets of the United States military," the operations officer explained. "Flying them into this location would be an act of war, but a private contractor operating independently, responding to a distress call from civilians who happen to be in the wrong place, that's just a good Samaritan helping people in trouble. That's the thinnest plausible deniability I've ever heard." "Yes, ma'am, it is, but it's what we have." Nadia studied the maps, the terrain analysis, the threat assessment. It was borderline suicidal, multiple hostile elements, no backup, no support, just her helicopter, her skills, and people who needed to not die. "I'll do it," she said, "under one condition. When this is over, you tell the truth about these operators, not publicly, but in their records. They don't get disavowed. They don't disappear. They get recognition for whatever service they're providing. The operations officer looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, that's not how these operations work. Then I'm not your pilot, because I won't extract people just so you can pretend they never existed. That's the deal. Take it or find someone else. Reese intervened. We'll make sure their service is documented, Commander, maybe not in the public record, but in the places that matter. It was as close to a guarantee as she was going to get. Then we have an agreement. When do we launch? The mission was everything the briefing suggested. It would be complex, dangerous, and dependent on perfect execution under impossible conditions. Nadia flew alone this time, just her, and a helicopter stripped down to essentials for maximum range. The insertion point was a valley so tight she had to fly sideways through sections of it. The LZ was a clearing barely larger than her rotor disc. And the operators she was extracting were wounded, exhausted, and fighting to hold off enemy forces that outnumbered them 10 to 1. She got them out, all of them, through a combination of flying skill, medical intervention, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept failure as an option. The extraction made the Venezuela run look easy. There were moments when she was certain she'd dive bullets through the canopy, engine warning lights, a tail rotor that developed a vibration that shouldn't exist. But the helicopter held together through force of will and maintenance excellence, and she brought those operators home. The debrief lasted 3 hours, every decision analyzed, every choice questioned. And at the end, the operations officer said something she hadn't expected. Commander, how would you feel about training our pilots, teaching them what you know about this kind of flying? Nadia considered this. I'm a contractor, you're military. The bureaucratic complications alone would be significant but not insurmountable. We need people who can teach the mindset, not just the mechanics. You've spent 6 years doing the impossible. Our pilots need to learn from that. So she became an instructor. Not full-time, she still flew missions for Artemis. But 2 weeks a month, she was at Fort Campbell or Eglin or wherever SOCOM needed her, teaching military pilots the lessons she'd learned about flying into places where the margin between success and death was measured in seconds. The young pilots were skeptical at first. Another civilian contractor, probably overselling her experience, probably coasting on some reputation that was 90% myth. Then she took them up, showed them what precise flying actually looked like, demonstrated maneuvers they'd assumed were impossible, and explained the decision-making process that separated calculated risk from suicidal stupidity. The skepticism disappeared fast. By the end of her first teaching rotation, they were calling her professor with genuine respect. By the end of the first year, she had pilots specifically requesting to train under her. By the end of 3 years, she'd become something of a legend in the special operations aviation community, the contractor who flew missions everyone else refused, and then came back to teach the next generation how to do the same. But legends, Nadia had learned, were heavy things. They demanded maintenance, performance, living up to expectations that grew with each retelling, and she was getting older, 51 now, still fit, still capable, but feeling each mission in ways she hadn't at 43 or 35 or 27. The question became, how long could she keep doing this? How long before age or injury or simple bad luck caught up with her? How long before she became one more name on the memorial wall, another cautionary tale about pilots who didn't know when to quit? She was contemplating these questions when Volkov called her in for a meeting. "We have a problem," he said without preamble, "and a proposal." "I'm listening." "The problem is that you're our most experienced extraction pilot. The proposal is that we want you to transition to full-time training and mission planning. Step back from direct operations. Focus on teaching others to do what you do." It was a retirement offer dressed up in professional language. Nadia felt it like a punch. "You think I'm too old to fly? I think you're too valuable to lose. Every mission you fly is a risk. Eventually, the odds catch up. When they catch up to you, we don't just lose a pilot. We lose 6 years of accumulated knowledge and experience. So you want me behind a desk. I want you alive, training the next generation, making sure that when you're gone, whenever that is, the work continues. Nadia stood, walked to the window. Outside, a helicopter was doing pattern work, the pilot practicing approaches. Young, aggressive, good skills but still learning judgment. Someone she could teach. Someone who could eventually do this work as well as she did. One condition, she said finally. I keep flying, reduced schedule. Maybe one mission every 2 months, but I don't stop completely, because the day I stop flying is the day I start dying. Volkov nodded. Deal, one mission every 2 months, high-value targets only, nothing routine. So she became a teacher in truth, spending most of her time at the Artemis facility or at military bases, showing pilots how to read terrain and weather and threat assessments, how to make decisions when there were no good options, how to live with the weight of the work they'd chosen. And every 2 months she flew. A journalist in Afghanistan, aid workers in Sudan, that one memorable mission where she extracted a billionaire's daughter from a kidnapping situation in Indonesia, an operation that paid enough to fund Artemis's medical charity work for 6 months. The balance worked. She was still useful, still relevant, still Valkyrie 6 when it mattered, but she was also building something beyond herself, creating institutional knowledge, ensuring that the work would continue after she was gone. She was 54 when Patricia called from San Diego. Nadia, I need to tell you something. Reese passed away. Heart attack. Sudden, I thought you should know. The news hit harder than expected. Captain No, Major Reese had been a connection to her previous life, to the person she'd been before Artemis. He'd been the one who saluted her in that emergency room, who recognized her when everyone else saw only what they expected to see. His death felt like another door closing, another piece of her history becoming memory instead of living connection. She flew to the funeral. Military honors, flag-draped coffin, Marines in dress blues executing rifle volleys with mechanical precision. And when the ceremony ended, Reese's son approached her, a young man in Navy uniform who had his father's eyes. Commander Kasravi, he asked. Just Nadia now. My father talked about you. A lot. He said you taught him that competence doesn't announce itself, that the best people are usually the ones nobody notices until the moment they become essential. Your father was kind and medicated. The son smiled. He was lucid when he said it. He kept a photograph, did you know, from that Helmand extraction. You standing next to your helicopter, covered in bloodsome yours, most from the casualties you'd loaded. He said it was a reminder that heroes don't look like the movies. Nadia didn't remember that photograph being taken, didn't remember much about that extraction beyond the mechanics of flying a damaged helicopter out of a combat zone, but it mattered that Reese had remembered, that he'd kept that image as a touchstone. He was a good man, she said simply. I'm sorry for your loss. He died believing he made the right choice, serving, protecting, being part of something larger than himself. The son paused. He said you showed him that, thank you. The flight back to North Carolina was quiet, contemplative. Nadia found herself thinking about legacy, about what remains when we're gone. Reese had left a son, a career, a record of service. What would she leave? Memories, stories, a name on a memorial wall someday commemorating another pilot who died doing the work. It wasn't enough. She wanted something more concrete, something that would outlast stories and memories and the slow fade of institutional knowledge. So she started writing. Not memoirs, those were self-serving and usually fiction disguised as fact, but training manuals, decision matrices, case studies of missions that had succeeded and missions that had failed. Everything she'd learned about extraction operations, distilled into formats that could be taught, studied, and implemented. Artemis published them internally. SOCOM requested copies. Other contractors started citing her work in their own training programs. And slowly, without intending to, Nadia Kasrevi became the definitive authority on combat extraction operations in denied territories. She was 56 when the call came that would define the final chapter of her operational career. A situation in Yemen not unusual. Yemen was always a disaster. But this situation involved 23 people, a mix of aid workers and local staff, trapped in a hospital as sectarian violence consumed the city around them. No government would intervene. Too many political complications, too much risk. The aid organization that employed them reached out to every contractor, every resource, every possible solution. Most said no. The mission was too large, too complex, too likely to end in catastrophe. Volkov called Nadia personally. I know what we agreed. One mission every 2 months, high-value targets only. But this is different. This is 23 lives. Civilians, non-combatants, people who went to Yemen to help and are now trapped because we've collectively decided that some conflicts are too messy to care about. How would it even work? One helicopter can't extract 23 people. 3 helicopters, 3 pilots, you'd lead. Plan the mission, make the calls, we'd follow your direction. Nadia thought about the memorial wall, about the names already on it, about the pilots who died doing exactly this kind of operation. Who are the other pilots? Marcus, you've flown with him, and a new contractor, Yuki Tanaka, former Japanese self-defense force, excellent pilot, young but steady. Young pilots make young pilot mistakes. You'd be there to make sure she doesn't. Yes or no, Nadia, I need an answer. She should have said no. Should have recognized that 3 helicopters extracting 23 people from an active combat zone was suicide dressed up as a mission. Should have stayed in her teaching role, safe and useful and alive. Yes, she said instead, I'm in, give me 2 days to plan. The planning was intricate, exhaustive, and ultimately dependent on factors beyond her control. They'd stage from Djibouti, fly into Yemen at night, land at the hospital, load everyone they could fit, then fly straight out to international waters before anyone could organize an effective response. Simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. The mission launched on a moonless night. 3 helicopters flying in formation, navigating by instruments and night vision, threading between population centers where anti-aircraft weapons were a real possibility. Nadia flew lead. Marcus flew left wing. Yuki flew right wing, keeping perfect formation despite this being her first combat extraction. They reached the hospital at 2:45 local time. The building was dark except for emergency lights. Smoke drifted from nearby structures. The aid workers were waiting in the courtyard, organized and ready, because they'd been given specific instructions on loading procedures. 23 people, 7 in Nadia's bird, 8 in Marcus's, 8 in Yuki's. They loaded fast, professional, the aid workers understanding that speed meant survival. 2 minutes on the ground, then lifting off in formation, turning west toward the coast and safety. That's when the situation degraded. Hostile fire from multiple sources. Not organized military response, just opportunistic violence from fighters who saw helicopters and decided they represented enemy forces. Bullets sparked off armored panels. Someone screamed. Nadia's windscreen cracked. Stay in formation, she ordered over the radio. Don't break, don't deviate, we push through. They pushed through, more fire, more impacts. Then Yuki's voice tight with stress. Valkyrie, I'm hit. Engine warning lights, I'm losing power. Nadia's mind calculated possibilities in fractions of a second. Yuki couldn't maintain altitude. Couldn't make it to the coast. Would crash in hostile territory with 8 civilians on board unless. Reduce load, Nadia said instantly. Put down in the next clear area. Transfer your passengers to Marcus and me. Then you fly solo back to Djibouti. I can make it, Yuki protested. No, you can't. And I won't watch 8 people die because you're too proud to admit your bird is compromised. Put down now. The transfer happened in a dried riverbed 5 kilometers from the coast. Yuki set down hard but controlled. 8 passengers scrambled out. 4 climbed into Marcus's helicopter, 4 into Nadia's. The overload meant both aircraft were now beyond safe operating capacity, but it was temporary overload versus certain crash. Get home safe, Nadia told Yuki. We'll see you in Djibouti. Yes, ma'am, sorry, ma'am. Nothing to apologize for. Taking fire is part of the job. Now go. Yuki lifted off, her damaged helicopter limping into the sky. Nadia and Marcus continued west, overloaded, flying aircraft that shouldn't be airborne at their current weights. Every meter of altitude was a struggle. Every kilometer forward was defying physics and engineering specifications. They made it to international waters, made it to a rendezvous with a ship that had been standing by, landed on the deck with fuel reserves measured in minutes. And as the rotors spun down, as the aid workers climbed out on shaking legs, Nadia finally allowed herself to acknowledge how close they'd come to catastrophe. All 3 helicopters made it back. All 23 civilians survived. The mission was classified as a success, but Nadia knew better. Success was measured in millimeters, the millimeter difference between bullets that hit engine components and bullets that missed, between decisions made and disasters avoided. That's it, she told Volkov when she returned to North Carolina. That's my last operational mission. I'm done. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her, just nodded and said, okay, what will you do now? Teach. Right. Make sure the next generation doesn't make the mistakes I made and doesn't die from the mistakes they'll make anyway. You saved 23 lives, Nadia. That's not a mistake. No, but it was close enough to disaster that I don't want to test my luck again. She transitioned to full-time instruction, teaching at Artemis, teaching for SOCOM, developing curriculum that other contractors adopted, speaking at conferences where people wanted to hear from the legend, from Valkyrie 6, from the woman who'd spent a decade flying into hell and somehow always flying back out. The years accumulated, 57, 58, 59. Her hair went completely gray. She needed reading glasses for flight manuals. Her knees hurt when weather changed. But her mind stayed sharp, her teaching improved, and the pilots she trained started making names for themselves in the same work she'd done. At 60, Artemis offered her a position as director of training. It came with a desk, a salary, and the understanding that her flying days were permanently over. She accepted. The work was still important, teaching pilots to stay alive, to make good decisions, to understand that extraction wasn't about heroism, but about competence executed under pressure. One afternoon, while reviewing training reports, she received a message from an unknown sender, just a photograph. No text. The image showed a helicopter, her old bird from the Yemen mission, with a small plaque mounted near the pilot's seat. The plaque read, Valkyrie 6 flew this aircraft into hostile territory to extract 23 civilians. Her competence saved lives. Her example teaches us how. Nadia stared at that photograph for a long time. Then she saved it, filed it away, and went back to work. Because that was the point, really. Not the plaques or the recognition or the call sign that people still used when they spoke about her. The point was the work. Always had been. Always would be. She worked until 65, then retired properly. Moved to a small town in Oregon. Got a new cat, this one named Pushkin because she developed a thing for Russian literature. Joined a book club. Learned pottery. Did all the things normal people did in retirement. But twice a year, she flew back to North Carolina. Guest lectured at Artemis. Talked to new contractors about the reality of extraction work. Answered questions from young pilots who wanted to know how she'd done it, how she'd survived, how she'd managed to be competent in a field that punished incompetence with death. And every time she gave them the same answer. You stop caring about being recognized. Start caring about being right. Do the work well enough that people survive. Everything else is just noise. At 70, she received an invitation to speak at a SOCOM conference on combat aviation, the keynote address. She almost declined. What could she say that she hadn't already said 100 times before? But the invitation was signed by someone whose name surprised her. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reese, Captain Reese's daughter, following in her father's footsteps. Nadia flew to Tampa. The conference was huge, hundreds of attendees, all of them involved in some aspect of special operations aviation. And when she walked to the podium to deliver her keynote, she saw Marcus in the audience. Yuki, now a senior instructor herself. Volkov, older but still carrying that aura of quiet competence. She'd prepared remarks, careful thoughts about the evolution of extraction doctrine, about lessons learned, about the future of combat aviation. But standing at that podium, looking at all those faces, some familiar, most not, she put aside her prepared text. "I'm going to tell you something nobody told me when I was starting out," she began. "This work will cost you. It'll cost relationships, health, peace of mind. It'll give you dreams you can't talk about and scars you can't explain. And if you're very lucky and very good, it'll give you the opportunity to save lives when nobody else can." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I spent 16 years in the Navy being underestimated, then another decade as a contractor being underestimated. People saw a middle-aged woman and assumed incompetence. Assumed I'd gotten my position through connections or quotas or anything except skill. And for a long time I let them think that, because proving them wrong wasn't as important as doing the work right. But here's what I learned. Competence doesn't need announcement. It just needs consistency. You don't have to be the loudest voice in the briefing room. You don't have to swagger or brag or make sure everyone knows how good you are. You just have to be good. Reliably, consistently good. And when it matters, when lives depend on your decisions, you have to be better than good. You have to be perfect." She looked directly at Lieutenant Commander Reese. "Someone once told me that heroes don't look like the movies. They look like ordinary people doing extraordinary work without needing credit. I didn't understand that when I was young. Thought recognition mattered. Thought respect was something you demanded. But respect is something you earn by being the person who shows up, does the work, and brings everyone home." The speech continued for another 20 minutes. Stories from her career. Lessons learned. Advice for the next generation. And when she finished, the applause was genuine, sustained, the kind that comes from people who understand they're hearing from someone who'd lived the life they were choosing. Afterward, Sarah Reese approached her. "Commander Kasrevi, my father would have been proud to hear that speech." "Your father taught me more than I taught him," Nadia replied. "He recognized competence when others saw only what they expected to see. That's a rare gift. He said you saved his life twice, once in Helmand, once in San Diego when you could have let other doctors handle his case but didn't." Nadia smiled. "I saved his life in Helmand. In San Diego I just did my job. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from what I understand, you've spent your entire career just doing your job. And somehow, that's been enough to save hundreds of lives and teach thousands of pilots how to do the same." It was a generous interpretation. Also, Nadia suspected, an accurate one, because that had been the secret all along. Not heroism, not exceptional talent, just competence applied consistently in situations where competence was the difference between life and death. She stayed at the conference for 3 days, talked with pilots, answered questions, sat in on briefings about new technologies, new tactics, new threats. The work had evolved since her active years, but the fundamentals remained the same. People still got trapped in dangerous places. Someone still had to extract them. And the pilots who did that work still needed to understand that it wasn't about glory or recognition or adding lines to their service records. It was about bringing people home. On the final day, Nadia visited the SOCOM Memorial. Rows of names, operators who died in service to missions most Americans would never know existed. She found Captain Reese's name, ran her fingers across the engraved letters, and said a quiet thank you to a man who'd seen her when she'd been invisible. Then she flew back to Oregon, to her quiet life, to Pushkin and her pottery wheel and her book club. The work continued without her. New pilots flew the missions. New instructors taught the classes. The memorial walls at Artemis and SOCOM added names as they always would, because this work demanded a price and people kept paying it. But every time a helicopter lifted off on an extraction mission, every time a pilot made a decision that saved lives, every time someone chose to do the work without needing credit for doing it, Nadia's influence was there. Not as legacy or legend, but as practical knowledge applied in practical ways. Competence passed down, lessons learned, the understanding that sometimes the most important people are the ones nobody notices until the moment they become essential. She was 73 when she received her final recognition, a letter from the Secretary of Defense informing her that she'd been awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for her contributions to Special Operations Aviation. The ceremony would be at the Pentagon. Full honors, her choice whether to attend. Nadia read the letter twice, then she called Volkov. "Did you know about this? I may have submitted some documentation, may have made some calls, may have spent several years making sure the right people understood what you'd accomplished. I told you I didn't want recognition. You told me you didn't need recognition. Different statement. But other people need to know what you did. Need to understand that competence matters more than credentials, that experience counts more than expectations, that the quiet ones are often the most capable." She attended the ceremony. Wore civilian clothes. She'd earned the right to wear a uniform but preferred not to. Stood while someone read a citation that summarized 30 years of service in language that made it sound more heroic than it had felt. The medal was heavy, ornate, completely unnecessary for her sense of accomplishment but meaningful as a symbol that someone, somewhere, had been paying attention. "Any remarks?" the secretary asked after presenting the award. Nadia thought about declining. Then she saw the younger officers watching, the ones who needed to hear this. Just one thought: the work we do in special operations, whether military or contract, doesn't exist to make us heroes. It exists to solve problems no one else can solve. If you enter this field wanting recognition, you're here for the wrong reasons. But if you enter wanting to be useful when it matters most, when lives depend on competence and judgment, and the ability to stay calm when everything is on fire, then you might be exactly what this community needs. She paused, weighing her final words. "I was a rookie nurse who didn't know her place, a contractor who didn't look like a pilot, a woman in spaces that weren't designed for women. But I was also someone who could fly a helicopter through conditions that would ground most pilots, who could make medical decisions under fire, who could bring people home when home seemed impossible to reach. That's what mattered, not what people expected me to be, what I actually was when it counted." The ceremony ended. She flew back to Oregon. The medal went in a drawer, along with her old flight wings and a photograph from Helmand Province, and all the other artifacts of a life spent doing work that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't lived it. Nadia Kasrevi died at 78 peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small. She'd requested no military honors, no fuss, no ceremony. But the people who came understood what she'd been. Marcus was there. Yuki was there. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reese came, representing her father's memory and her own gratitude. And in the back of the chapel, a group of younger pilots sat quietly, people Nadia had trained years ago who'd gone on to fly the missions, make the saves, continue the work. They didn't speak much, just sat with the weight of knowing that someone who'd shown them how to be better was gone. After the service, they went to a bar Nadia would have approved. She'd never been precious about mourning. They told stories, not the dramatic ones, the quiet ones. The times Nadia had corrected their approach angles. The moments she'd explained why certain decisions led to survival and others led to statistics. She never bragged, Marcus said, raising his glass. Never needed to, just showed up, did impossible work, and taught the rest of us how to do the same. They drank to that, to competence over credentials, to quiet excellence over loud mediocrity, to the woman who'd been underestimated by people who should have known better and who'd responded by simply being undeniably, consistently, impossibly good at the work that mattered. Valkyrie 6, the rookie nurse, the contractor nobody expected, the woman who'd spent a lifetime proving that recognition was optional but competence was essential. Her legacy wasn't plaques or medals or citations. It was the pilots who flew better because she taught them, the lives saved because someone had shown them how, the understanding that sometimes the most important people are the ones who never need to announce themselves because their work speaks volumes their words never would. In the days following her death, Artemis installed a new plaque on their memorial wall, not with the names of the dead, but in a separate section reserved for founders, legends, people whose contributions had defined the company. The plaque was simple, like Nadia herself had been. Commander Nadia Kasrevi, USN Ret. Valkyrie 6. She showed us that competence needs no announcement, that excellence requires no recognition, that the best among us are often the least expected. She brought people home. She taught us how to do the same. This is enough. And it was enough.